Hi Heikki, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Jonathan, thanks a lot.
Can you introduce yourself to our listeners for anyone who doesn't know you?
My name is Heikki Ikäheimo. I'm a senior lecturer in philosophy at UNSW, and I'm originally from Finland. I've been here now a bit, 15 years actually. Spent 3 years in Germany before coming here. That's who I am.
Can you sort of explain to us what growing up in Finland was like and how you stumbled into philosophy?
Yes, stumbling on is is the right expression here. As you may know, Finland has a really good school system, and it had a good school system in my time too, which is now a while ago already. I was born in a small town or village in central Finland, and I went to school there, did the 12 years there, but philosophy wasn't the school subject at all at that time, so I had no exposure to philosophy at school, and I didn't have much of an idea what to do in the university either. Went after school to do my compulsory military service, like most Finnish males did and still do, and then the question was where to go from here. And I thought I was pretty good in English, and I thought I'll just take the entrance exam in English because you get a free day from the army once you go to entrance exams. I didn't have much of an idea about that, but I just managed to get through. I was accepted to the uni, and the day I left the army, literally the guys left me in front of the university, and I took it from there. But turned out that English wasn't for me. It just wasn't challenging enough for my mind. So I was kind of, I guess, ambitious and curious, but I didn't know where to put my ambition and curiosity. Then I had the good luck of going to work as a stagehand at the local city theater, which many students did. It was a fun job to see the stage settings and the plays and all of that. And then I met other students who were doing all these interesting sounding things like political science and sociology and philosophy. And there at the coffee tables, listening to these people, I thought that the guy who said that he studied philosophy, he sounded like the most interesting one. So probably it was the most annoying one. But anyway, so I became really curious about what is this thing called philosophy. He's really kind of asking really interesting, deep questions, and I went to find out, and was browsing the Open University. At this point, I had stopped studying English because I thought that I'd study a profession for myself. So I did with the Vocational School. I studied a certain profession, printing, whatever. But I was doing that at that point, and then went to the Open University to took my first philosophy class there, and took a couple of other classes there, and pretty much immediately realized this is for me. This is what I want to do. And then once the Vocational School 2 years was closing or ending, I applied again to university this time with philosophy as my major, and then political science and I think social politics, social policy as my minors. And I've been doing it ever since. I was just kind of lucky to find something or the thing that fits my character, and that's how I'm. So I never, at that point and much later too, I didn't have a kind of anything like an idea of a career in philosophy. But I was ambitious and worked hard, and you do the one thing, then a door opens for you, or you see that there are opportunities to take that, and then you work hard again, and then there are other opportunities. That's what I've been doing, and here I am now, many years later.
Oh, yeah. So you never sort of gave too much consideration regarding, I guess, the career aspect of it. You just sort of put your head down and...
No, I didn't worry about it at all, to be honest. It has to be said that the Finnish education system was very generous, especially in those years. So that I had this opportunity to start studying one thing at the university and then do a vocational degree just to give myself more time to think what is that I actually want to do. And then I could go back to the university, and I was paid by the state. I had to take some student loan as well. But the system was so generous that you could spend quite a bit of time not worrying too much what you're going to do. But it was probably just also my personality. I was playing rock music, and it just wasn't in my character to think of anything as prosaic as money or or profession or vocation or career or anything like that. Obviously, then. But I have to say that there was also something else happening during that time in Finland. Namely, there was a serious economic recession. That was the first half of the 90s, and very high unemployment percentage. So a lot of people were unemployed. So it was kind of a good time to focus on study. Because, I mean, what else do you do? There aren't many jobs around. Yeah, I'll just study. And that's what I did. I wasn't really worried about job prospects or anything like that. I just worked hard, and I guess I have been lucky too that there have been opportunities for me to grab.
So what age were you when you finished your sort of compulsory military service?
That was right after year 12 for me.
So you were around 19?
Thereabouts, yeah, that's right, yeah.
And then you went to university for English?
Yeah, I would have been 20 at that point, 19, 20, and then studied 2 years English, and then 2 years in the Vocational School printing, and then more years philosophy, so 5 years I think.
What did you do in the vocational school?
That was printing. So the story of that is that I played this rock band. At that point in history, I mean, people playing rock, they'd like to do their own record covers.
Oh yeah.
Do the kind of typesetting and the picture, all of that artwork, etc. Lots of guys who were playing in rock bands went to this particular thing at the Vocational School, where you learn to print your record covers. Also learn to print self-made magazines and that sort of thing. It was kind of cool thing to do, but it wasn't professionally for me. Not at all. I mean, I had 2 weeks work experience in that, and it was the most horrible experience I've ever had. I mean, sitting on a kind of office environment, giving the impression that you're busy at work, though I didn't actually have anything to do there. The bosses in their glass box observing people, and just wasn't for me.
What instrument did you play?
Guitar, guitar, electric guitar. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I find like a lot of our lecturers are actually ex-musicians. A lot of the ones I interview anyway.
Isn't it so? Right, yeah.
Being ex-musicians of some sort.
Yeah, I guess there's something common, the kind of creativity in art, music, and the creativity in thinking. There's commonality there.
Were there any favorite bands in particular that you liked? You and your friends?
Anything, lots of. But what we played was something kind of super heavy and dark and gloomy. It kind of started as kind of more mainstream, kind of Iggy and Stooges kind of guitar rock thing, and then developed into this really dark and gloomy thing. But I gave that up. What happened then when I started seriously studying doing philosophy was that I totally gave that up. It was kind of the.
Was it sort of just a natural sort of let that go because you were so.
The thing was that I realized that I don't have time to practice anymore to be at the level where I would actually want to be, that was satisfying myself. So I didn't want it just to be a hobby. So I took it very seriously. I dropped it and been taking philosophy very seriously. But I absolutely love music. I listen to music all the time. And I can.
Still rock music?
Yeah, mostly rock and pop. Yeah, mostly rock and pop. Yeah, yeah, some classical as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So you started your philosophy studies around 24, I'd say. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was 24 already when I took philosophy as my major. That's right. Yeah.
And then you graduated, presumably around.
I was close to 30 already.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that's right. So you
And
would.
then did you immediately? I don't know if there were honors back then, or did you go?
Well,
what was your progression?
the default degree in Finland those days, and I think still is, was masters. Yeah, and in the kind of in generation before me, or still the kind of older students there, it was common that masters would take 7 years. So there was quite a bit of freedom to find yourself. I did it in 5 years, because I had already studied philosophy at the Open University. Yeah, and you had to write a master's thesis at the end.
Do you remember what your thesis was about?
That was on on Heidegger's interpretation of Hegel, which I've since learned was a kind of popular study in those years, kind of mid 90s. My colleague and friend Simon Lumsden has done similar things roughly at the same time here in Australia, Heidegger and Hegel as well. But it was based on what we studied, what we read during undergraduate, those undergraduate years. And what was really decisive for me was one particular teacher, Jussi, who was teaching already there in the Open University. And he happened to be a Hegelian, but he did lots of other things too. And it was kind of, in many ways, a role model for me, a kind of model of how to be someone who does philosophy and who does all of other kinds of things. It was kind of interesting, kind of cool person in my eyes. And he then was the main teacher for me during those years studying philosophy at the university as well. And what we used to do was to have these seminars, kind of seminar reading group kind of style of studying, reading big books by Hegel, Heidegger, and other interesting figures. So I had that background. And it was really Hegel that interested me most. But it was of course also extremely challenging figure to read. But it was somehow it's kind of the thing that the kind of thinker that everyone in European philosophy refers back. So it's kind of a bit of a kind of initiation right, that kind of have the right to say something in that area. You need to have some idea of Hegel. So that's kind of how I ended there, and I will kind of remained there ever since. So Hegel is always an important influence in my thinking and work.
What was your experience sort of going through your masters and trying to write your thesis? Because obviously picking Hegel was such a difficult subject.
Yeah, so that relates to the topic of the sociality of doing philosophy and studying philosophy, because it was really essential for me that I had this group of friends studying philosophy, and I had this teacher who was interested in guiding us through these difficult texts. So I would never have been able to do any of that alone. It was very much a collective effort of reading a difficult text week after week, month after month, and eventually year after year. And that's how I built those kind of foundation to then write a thesis. Though that writing a thesis is hard work, it is mostly lonely work. And I guess the key for me for having been able to write the thesis was that I had a strict deadline. It's good to have deadlines sometimes when some work is difficult and hard to perform. Namely, there was a job waiting for me in Helsinki teaching philosophy. In those years, while I was doing my undergraduate studies, philosophy became a compulsory school subject in secondary schools in Finland. And my teacher Jussi had some connections to Helsinki. And in one school there they needed a philosophy teacher. And I got that job. It was only a few hours a week, but anyway, it was waiting there for me. So I had a strict deadline. I had to finish the thesis and then take up that job. And that's what I did. I just kind of kind of buried myself in a room for several weeks and did it.
Yeah, well, oh, you mentioned as well that sort of having your teacher and your friends really helped you sort of get through your masters and, you know, do all the readings and stuff. In all your experiences of living in Germany and Australia and potentially teaching, you know, multiple places as well, do you find that that is a very common experience, that a lot of students do naturally come together and there is a teacher to guide them? Or is that something kind of rare?
I think it depends very much on the circumstances. Depends on the kind of structure of studies and the kind of system of university, and probably it's also a cultural thing. So I found that it seems to be more difficult here. Part of that is to do with the fact that the experience of studying in the university is much more resembling here of being at school than it is in other places like Germany, and at least was in those days in Finland. So that there is this idea that there's a number of courses and you get a number of points, and there's a number of months or years during which you have to do. Everything is really kind of quantified. And students are very conscious of how many points they get from whatever, and marks and assessment tasks are extremely important here. They weren't at all that important in Finland
How are they
Germany.
sort of treated?
Well, I mean, here it's quite usual that there are, say, 3 different assessment tasks in a course, and they might even be then divided into smaller pieces. There are almost one. After whatever course, and the courses were longer, you would write one essay or do one exam, etc. So the focus was much more on just the process of learning rather than the assessing thing. So one thing here is that I think assessment, the heavy weight that the Austrian system gives to assessments kind of misleads, directs the focus to not the right place, not the actual process of learning, which often is not really calculable easier. So there are those kind of structural things here, and of course the thing that the default degree is only 3 or 4 years. It is pretty cramped. There's not a whole lot of time for it. Also, the thing that there's a kind of cultural difference here, which has to do with cost of living, basically. Yeah. that many of our students, they live with mom and dad, so that they don't have kind of independent life in the sense in which one has when one leaves home and live somewhere and then is a university student. So there's a little bit of that too. So they kind of have a feeling that here the feeling is more like being at school than it was in Germany or Finland, and thus there's a little bit less of kind of a grassroots student initiative here than in some other places. There's no necessity why that would have to be that way. I mean, it's basically just up to students to organize reading groups, organize this and that, and do things together. It's really important, I think, to really understand that the time that one spends together with others, learning and reading, is not wasted. One often thinks that it's wasted time. This is not real work, since it is so productive. I mean, really difficult texts are something that one really needs many minds to figure out what's actually going on there. And also the enjoyment of doing things together, because then it becomes a social thing. Just reading something really difficult, it can be a lonely thing, and writing things can be a really lonely thing. So it's good to have that sociality around one. And one just learns so much from other minds, hears ideas from other minds. That's incredibly important, I think.
I think this might be a personal bias, but it seems like in Sydney and perhaps wider Australia today, the emphasis on sort of humanities studies is very low, and everyone sort of is encouraged to go to something more practical, more pragmatic, something with a career sort of at the end of the rainbow, right? At the end of your degree. And I wonder what your thoughts are on sort of perhaps decreasing engagement in humanities and sort of, I think a lot of people would find that, you know, to them it seems like a waste of time to get together and read a complicated book, and you know, that might be something they view as just intellectual stimulation or interest, something hobby-like, but not as important as someone who, you know, as a philosophy teacher, must see that in a very different way.
Yeah, I think there are two sides to that. One is whether we should consider university studies mainly from the vocational perspective, or whether it also has other aims. And I do think it seriously has other aims. The universities are places of higher learning, higher education, where the kind of the society learns to think about itself by educating young people to think about the society, think about how, say, Australian life should be organized, etc. If we don't do that, then we lose this capacity for self-reflection, and all the technical stuff is not going to do us as much good. So we don't know what we should be doing in the first place. So there's that kind of broad kind of national interest perspective, if you want, but also from a individual perspective. And these are the years in life that you can learn so much. I mean, they will never come back. This is a unique opportunity to learn something truly interesting. Too narrowly focusing just on what comes later, the job, whatever it might be, I think it's partly wasting the time that this fabulous opportunity and luxury of this few years at uni, learn anything about the world, basically. So there's that side of things, that learning to think is generally important for the society and for the individual, and kind of enriching one's mind is something that will serve one for the rest of one's life. There's nothing in it that anyone would ever regret, having studied philosophy, etc. So that's the kind of humanistic side to it. But the other side is the employment side. I mean, there's this misperception that people graduating from humanities or philosophy are not employable, which is not at all the case. I mean, all the statistics show that they're very much employable. And then it's also, all of this, the employability side is connected also to the question of what sort of capacities or qualifications are needed 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Universities are not at least only meant to prepare people from very narrowly defined particular tasks that exist now. They might not exist in 5 or 10 or 15 years. What the university study gives people are these general capacities to process information and general understanding of complex processes, etc., which means that one has the capacity to learn new things, more particular things in this or that profession. So, too narrowly understanding universities as servicing the labor market, so to say, at this point or in 2 years, etc. It's just really bad politics, since that's not how the world works. We don't actually know what exactly is going to be required 5 years from now or 10 years now. I mean, if we think, for instance, what the generative AI is now doing, I mean, we don't know that yet, but it looks quite probable it's just going to make many professions almost out of business, or that there are going to be way less jobs in particular areas than we would have thought 5 years ago. So if people are just narrowly trained in those professions, they are going to be in trouble. Vocational schools do that, but I don't think universities should think too narrowly about where they prepare their students.
You mentioned something about the general capacity of learning, and I sort of wonder whether you see a difference between how different faculties encourage those different aspects of general learning. Because in my experience, I've enjoyed my philosophy courses ever since I started doing them a lot more than any sort of science subjects, because the way they're structured are very different. And I previously mentioned that I have exams coming up for psychology, and ever since I was in my very first year, it has always sort of been geared towards memorization and almost rote learning, except in maybe particularly few subjects such as statistics, where you have to actually apply these concepts that you learn. But for the most part, it's very rote in comparison to philosophy, where you get to reflect a lot more and create your own interpretation and actually develop these critical thinking skills that a lot of universities claim to teach or encourage. And so I kind of wonder, are they sort of making a mistake in terms of over focusing on the vocation aspect, and as a result making the studying also very mechanical?
Well, one way to think about that would be to think of the university as a whole, and to think of what a university student going through the university years and having a degree from a university should learn. I think it's perfectly fine that, say, the technical disciplines teach kind of contents, but that is fine insofar as then someone else at least teaches also those kind of reflective skills of thinking. So if philosophy, like in some countries like Norway, for instance, philosophy is a compulsory gen ed for all university students, and I think that's a really good idea, because then you can focus on that kind of rote learning or content teaching in elsewhere, and then you also get the kind of capacity for critical reflection and kind of seeing things from a broader perspective. Then the next question then would be how to integrate those aspects of university studies so that they are not just kind of separate boxes, so to say. But it's certainly true that in philosophy we do teach also content. I mean, we do teach the history of philosophy, and do teach what particular thinkers have thought and written, etc. But the main thing is to learn to think. So we, in principle, read all of the previous writers and thinkers from this perspective. What do they teach us in our own endeavor and our own needs to think about and reflect about our lives, about society and where it's going, etc. So in philosophy, the kind of content and the reflection of the content is they are very much integrated by its very nature, whereas that's not necessarily the case in other sciences in how they are actually taught currently. Of course, in any other science, in any science or discipline, when one starts asking for the kind of fundamental or foundational questions, then one enters into philosophical questions actually. So all the sciences at the most fundamental level start shading into philosophy. And so those people who are going to be really good in a particular science, they probably have the capacity to think also of those foundational questions. They do have some or need some philosophical thinking skills there, rather than just narrowly knowing their discipline.
You mentioned sort of the capacity to understand the text and self-reflect and do engage in this critical thinking, and then also reading them to see how it applies to your own life. I was sort of wondering, what has your studies of Hegel sort of taught you about your own life and anything of that sort?
Yeah, right. Well, there's one particular theme that is being very central in all of my philosophical work since pretty much from the beginning. That is a theme from Hegel. It's not only from his thought, but it's most famous from Hegel's thought. That is the theme of recognition, mutual recognition or intersubjective recognition, and that's why that kind of caught my attention. That theme was exactly, I think, because it is so applicable in my own life, in life general, in what I experience in my life. The relationship between one's own understanding of oneself and then the perceptions of others of oneself. That's kind of the main kind of dynamics that this recognition stuff is about, and the mutuality of this interdependence of one's self-perception and perception of the world, of the perceptions of others. And I thought that was, when I kind of bumped into that topic, I thought that was incredibly insightful. There's also the kind of more personal, probably kind of national thing. Coming from a small country, relatively young country, the question is kind of in the national psyche always, what do they think of us? Do they take us seriously? Do they think we are good in this or that? It's kind of a small country obsession too. So it's not surprising someone from Finland might be interested in that topic. But definitely that is a theme that has an incredible array of applications to all kinds of different areas of life, and that's why I found it so interesting and kind of has remained with me ever since. Probably will remain for a long time. That's one of the that's maybe the main top kind of mainstay in my thinking from Hegel. But more broadly, Hegel is a non-dualist thinker. Hegel always thinks of the connection of things. He's never satisfied with kind of analyzing, dividing things into black and white or good and bad or or yes and no, etc. He's always interested in the connections of things and the kind of interdependencies, etc., which I find, again, an incredibly useful way to think of social life and everything else in reality. And he's also a holistic thinker. So he emphasizes the importance of understanding everything in its relations to other things and in the broader context. And I find that those very important insights. Not only understand the individual, myself or any other individual in the social context, but understanding, say, a particular country in the context of the world system, understanding humanity or the human species in the context of nature at large, etc. Very, very important ways of seeing things that I find in Hegel.
How would you say, from the first instances of Hegel coming up with his ideas of recognition and the other thinkers with him during that time, and the current state of what we think of recognition and what most philosophers today think of recognition, how would you say it has progressed or evolved over the years?
Right. So one thing is that Hegel does not have a theory of recognition. It's not a theme that he kind of develops at any length, at any particular place in his writing. It's just something kind of pops up again and again in some crucial places in his work, and this is so has resulted in this topic kind of resurfacing in European philosophy again and again in ways that are not strictly to be found in Hegel. People have just used the general idea in different productive ways. One example is Alexander Koshev, the very important Russian French thinker and teacher, in whose lectures on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, many, or if not most, of the immediate post-war French intellectuals sat. So they were very much influenced by his understanding of recognition. And for him, the struggle for recognition was basically the kind of engine of history. So he was thinking of human history in those terms. But also but another place, not totally disconnected, where the general theme of recognition has played a role is in, broadly speaking, Marxist thinking. Hegel has these famous figures of the master and slave, the struggle of recognition between the master and slave, which very easily kind of translates into think of class relations, etc. But then from the 90s, there's a more recent resurgence of thinking about recognition in the context of identity and difference. So Charles Taylor wrote this famous paper in 1992, which basically deals with recognition for ethnic minorities and what that could mean. It could mean kind of recognition in the sense of attributing equal rights, or then it could mean recognition in the sense of somehow appreciating or supporting the particular cultural identity. In this case, the French speakers in Canada, but could be equally well be a gender, particular gender group or particular ethnic group or whatever. So this kind of recognition thinking has been associated with questions of identity since the 90s, but that is only one application of the idea, so to say. So it's kind of general idea which has been utilized in many interesting and productive ways after Hegel.
Yeah, and one of the philosophers that also touches on recognition is Axel Honneth, who we learned towards the end of your social critique class. And I was kind of wondering whether you could explain to us sort of what drew you to Axel Honneth in particular and his concepts of recognition.
Yeah.
I know you also wrote a book in response or in tandem with his ideas.
Yeah. What originally drew me to his thinking was just the fact that he published this book, The Struggle for Recognition, while I was an undergraduate student. So thanks to him, and then also this some work by Charles Taylor, that was a kind of big topic in those years, in the late 90s, etc. And he was the big name at that point. And I had some, through my teacher, some contacts to Germany, also to other German philosophers who had already earlier dealt with the topic. Ludwig Sieb is a kind of grand old man in Germany of thinking about recognition the last decades, and I had, through my teacher, Jussi, connections to him and others, but then also through coincidences and connections, a connection to Axel Honneth was then kind of came up. I met him a couple of times and invited him to Jyväskylä, which is the place in Finland where I studied, and we had a workshop with him. And his work was just incredibly interesting and productive in my mind, and there still is around this topic. I mean, the basic ideas of the book Struggle for Recognition was originally in 92 in German, and then the mid-90s in English. It's basically a theory of a good society. A theory of a good society, according to Honneth, is one in which people have reasonable opportunities to receive fair recognition for what they are, what they do, also for their rights, etc. And why this is important is precisely because of the effect of recognition or lack thereof to people's conceptions of themselves. So if one hasn't had the experience of being respected as an equal member of society, for instance, with equal rights with others, it's very difficult to have this kind of robust self-respect that one can kind of stand up straight among other people. Similarly, if one hasn't had the experience of one's contributions being properly acknowledged or seen as valuable or appreciated as valuable, it's not that easy to kind of see them as valuable oneself. One needs to have this kind of validation of one's value, of the worth of what one is doing from others. And if one doesn't receive adequate recognition, then it's difficult to have these positive conceptions of oneself, and that will end up having effects on how well one is able to live one's life, basically. realize one's kind of know and have the courage to think of what I want to do in life, and the courage to push through and kind of basically live with self-confidence, self-respect, etc., among others. So there's that kind of basic idea of a good society as one which provides people recognition, therefore the psychological means for satisfying self-realization, agency, etc. But there's also a kind of political theory according to which we can look at social struggles, say the struggles for women's rights, struggles by gender minorities, etc., from this point of view of struggle for recognition. The idea there is that they are not merely kind of strategy struggles for some material or other goods, but they are precisely struggles for having a kind of adequate status in the eyes of others, being respected, being valued, etc. So I think it's a really important perspective to social movements and social struggles. So there are many fruitful ideas in that book. I myself developed the ideas in slightly different ways, but it's been one of the main influences on me on my thinking of recognition, Michael Honneth.
Mm. How do you think that concept of almost developing those psychological capacities through those two basic needs for recognition?
Actually three. Three. Yeah, there's kind of being cared, and then being respected, and then being valued or esteemed for one's capacity. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. There's three kind of requirements to develop these psychological capacities. How do you think that that can be applied today? How do you see it being applied to, say, students at UNSW who you've been teaching for a couple of years? Do you find that this environment supports them in those three basic ways?
Well, one way of thinking about that is thinking about what happens in a classroom. And I do have very much these issues in mind when I'm in a classroom. I basically think of some of these things slightly different from Honneth, but basically the idea of respect is very important. Now, Honneth means by respect basically legal respect, having legal equality or equal status in front of law. But there's another concept of respect which I think is probably more applicable, more interesting in everyday life, which is that of kind of having a say, being listened to, being taken seriously as someone who has views, who's worth listening to, etc. And I think that mutual respect in this sense is incredibly important, I think, in all aspects of life, basically, but also especially in educative context, where learning should be a collective effort. And it really requires that people listen to each other, that they kind of take each other seriously. They give voice to everyone. So everyone ought to have a voice there. And everyone should feel that they are taken serious. It's worth saying what I think. I mean, what I think might be wrong, that doesn't matter. But I'm one of the thinkers here, one of the speakers here, and I have my perspective, and now we're putting our minds and our perspectives together. And that's only happening when people have this kind of basic respect to each other, that they kind of treat and take each other and see each other as people who have a say, who are worth being listened to. That's very important. And then there's the kind of appreciation for contribution aspect, which is also that we should be kind of grateful to each other for their contribution to various things that are good for us, such as what we learn in a classroom. And then there's the care or concern aspect, which I think is incredibly important. Honneth thinks that that's something that applies only in kind of close personal relationships, in family, in friendships, in romantic relationships. But I do think it has much wider application. I think we are very sensitive to the experience that someone doesn't actually care about my well-being, whether I suffer or whether things go well wouldn't make much of a difference to that person. Even if it's a stranger, we are sensitive to those things, and I think that sort of kind of basic care and concern is just part of kind of good life together, which should be there also in a classroom. That people do care about each other, kind of have basic concern for everyone's well-being and for everyone's development, everyone's learning, etc.
Yeah. So it seems like the social aspect of how to encourage recognition is crucial, but I was also wondering, do you think that something, say like economics, say like a looming recession would have any impact on the concept of recognition and how it plays out on day-to-day life?
Yeah. The kind of the extent to which people can afford to afford recognition to each other depends on various things. One of them is whether they are or feel that they are in a context where they have to compete against each other. So if the context is very competitive, then obviously the success of the other is not a good thing for me. I want the other not to succeed. I want to win and the other lose, etc. So if we think or are forced to think of our coexistence with particular others or others in general in those terms, then it's very unlikely that we are kind of going to have much or at least all of these forms of recognition for each other. And of course, in difficult economic times, that may be the case, that may happen. But the opposite may also happen, that when people feel that everyone's suffering now, that may also move them kind of build a sense of solidarity between people, etc. That was my experience during those times of recession in Finland. It wasn't a kind of dog-eat-dog world, since there weren't many jobs available anyway. It wasn't much to compete for, and that very much has to do then with how the society is organized in general. One of the things that I mention ad nauseam in my lectures is the way in which the housing market in Australia works. It basically puts people in positions where they are plundering each other, to use this word from translation of Marx's early writings. That kind of Austrians like to think of themselves as having this thing called mateship, which is true too. Australia is a very egalitarian society, which fairly high level of social solidarity. But the housing market is one in which is kind of built in such a way, has developed in such a way that people are basically there to plunder each other, to get the better of each other. And this is such an important kind of talking point and such an important determining factor of what happens in Australian lives, then it does have this effect of kind of corroding solidarity, corroding these binds of mutual recognition, etc.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the sort of comparison between Finland and Australia, but you've covered that, and it does seem scary as a student who's currently doing his undergrad and potentially looking at a recession coming up in the near future, and I suppose in some ways I might be anxious in that way and wonder about my own future and what I should be doing, stuff like that.
Yeah, that is the experience I think every university student will have. Kind of at any time in history, most people will be worried about, and of course will be thinking about what's awaiting for me. And there may be a recession, but recessions are usually not very long. And to put a positive note on this, Australia still is an incredibly lucky country. Whatever happens in the world, it's not going to be very bad here. It's going to be probably much easier here than in many other places, thanks to just kind of the chance that we have natural resources, etc., and that Austria is a very desirable country for people to move in. So it's also the immigration thing here is something that drives the economy. There are many more opportunities here for young people than in many other countries, it seems to me.
What has made you stay in Australia for 15 years?
Well, I came here first to do a 3-year postdoc at Macquarie University. And at that point, I was not planning to stay. I didn't have any idea of staying there, but then I got lucky. It was part of my job description as a postdoc there to write an application for longer funding for the Austrian Research Council, and I happened to get that. So I get some more years of research time, and with that, then I got a job offer. And kind of things worked out well for me, and after being a few years here, kind of my life started being more and more here, and I didn't see a reason to go back anymore. And now I very much feel like this is where my life is. It of course has downsides. Most importantly, the distance, the tyranny of distance. Much of the interesting work in my area is done in Europe or the United States, and not being there obviously means that I'm not as intensively connected to what's happening there as one would be living there and being able to go to every workshop and conference, etc. But Austria has become my home, and it's a good country. I really like being here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've touched on the 3 years you spent in Germany as well. Was that part of studies too?
That was actually my first postdoc. Yeah, so I did first 3 years of postdoc there, and then a second postdoc at Macquarie, and my first postdoc there was in Frankfurt am Main, where Axel Honneth was at that point the a professor there, and also the head of the Institute for Social Research, this kind of Frankfurt school center there. So I did the 3 years there around Axel Honneth, the people. It was an international group of people. People all around the world came to his seminar, and many good friends there who have stayed contacts for me ever since. They live now all around the world and are academics in different parts of the world.
So has your master's first and second postdoc all been sort of about or regarding the topics of recognition?
Well, yeah. So actually, after the master's, that was my last degree. So I had to do a Ph.D. obviously. In the Finnish system, in those years you could do first so-called licentiate thesis, which is what I did. At that point, doing the licentiate thesis, I already had a job at the university. That was typical in those, or usual in those years, that you have this kind of low-level academic job called assistant, and in that job, part of what you are supposed to do is to write the next thesis. And the next thesis then was this licentiate thesis. I did that in 3 years, and then the promise is that if that goes well, then you get another 3 years, and then you do your doctoral thesis. And the doctoral thesis then was finally on recognition. And then during my postdoc years, I was very much working on that topic, and have been working on it ever since.
I wanted to ask as well, because I think sometimes philosophy has the reputation of being very almost solipsistic, in the sense that it all comes out of your head, and it's all observing your own thoughts and all of that. But you mentioned that you studied, was it international relations or?
Actually, political science, or politology it was called there, and social policy, they were my minors.
Yeah, and you also mentioned in our previous conversation that you listen to a lot of sort of news and keep up with current affairs and all of that.
Yeah.
And I was sort of wondering how that impacts on your philosophy and what you talk about and what you write about.
Yeah, right. So I do have a very much of an amateur interest in international politics. I guess it stems from the experience of living abroad or being a kind of citizen of the world. Really a formative experience for me to leave my country of origin, to move to another country and live there, and for the first time to see my country as origin, not as the place, but as one of many places. That's really important experience. That really kind of shifted my attention, so to say, in such a way that I became really much more interested in international affairs, and that's kind of remained with me ever since. It doesn't show in any direct way in my work. I've written almost nothing about international relations so far, only one paper recently. So I wouldn't say that it affects my work much, but it is really an interest in me. Maybe it does affect my work in the sense that my recent book on recognition and the human life form is very much about a global critical social philosophy, kind of taking a global view of the human life form in general. Much of critical social philosophy, which is what I basically do, is very much focused on a particular historical and cultural context, partly because of being careful of not generalizing the particular Western European experience over humanity at large, of which there's a really bad history. It's partly that, but it has led to this sort of situation where people writing in English or German in the area of social philosophy mainly have in mind their own social and political circumstances or something very similar. Whereas for me now, then moving to Australia, it's really kind of formative, another next kind of formative step. As I said at the beginning of my book, whereas in Germany, one's neighbors would be, say, the French or the Dutch or the Danes or the Czech, etc. Very similar kinds of people. So even if one would have mainly in mind writing social political philosophy, how things are in Germany, it will end up having lots of applicability in the area. Things are completely different in Australia. I mean, our closest neighboring country is Papua New Guinea. I mean, what's valid here is not necessarily valid there. And if we want to kind of develop discursive means to discuss about what is a good society, how a good social relation, what are good social relations, etc. We can't take any of the kind of institutional historical specificities of Western Europe or Australia or particular populations in Australia for granted. We need to think at a more general level. So that's from that point of view, my thinking is actually very much global thinking. I'm thinking of anywhere in the world, which is of course a kind of precarious exercise in that it's very easy to make the mistake of kind of generalizing from one's very particular historical, cultural, institutional context or experience over humanity at large and making big mistakes there. But I think it is very important at this point in the history of humankind, basically, where everything is so interdependent and where we are facing challenges that are really global challenges that require everyone everywhere basically being involved in somehow in the solutions, whatever they are. So that's not so much about international politics, but generally thinking about humanity and the globe in a kind of global way.
How do you manage to not slip into that overgeneralization? Or
Yeah.
because it seems like a very difficult challenge in some way.
Yeah. So in the book and elsewhere, I developed a kind of social ontology of human personhood, a social ontology of the human life form that articulates a kind of basic structures of human life independently of institutional cultural specificities. What are the kind of basic requirements of human life, and recognition will turn out to be important there. And from these kind of very general ideas of the human life form in general, I then try to draw implications with regard to what is a better or worse kind of human relationship or institutional arrangement, etc. So I start from that extremely general level, and then say that all of this will have different specifications then, depending on the cultural history and other specificities of a particular place, and so forth. It's kind of unpopular, or has been an unpopular view in critical social philosophy until quite recently, but I think it's becoming much more popular now. There's much more interest in the discipline called philosophical anthropology, which basically is especially about those kind of basic structures of human life in abstraction from the cultural, etc., specificities, which are then a next kind of level question or inquiry.
What would you say has been the factors that influenced the sudden interest in philosophical anthropology?
There are probably many. One of them definitely is the awareness of the dependence of the human life form on the natural environment and the immediate crisis with our relations to nature. I think that is definitely one of the reasons why philosophers more and more think of human being or humanity. There's a bit of a, in my view, kind of misunderstanding that thinking of human being or humanity is always a kind of anthropocentric enterprise. I don't see it that way at all. Being interested in the human life form is not saying that the human life form is the most important thing there is. It's not centralizing it. Rather, the way that we need to be thinking about it, which is the way that I try to think about it, is especially exactly putting it in its proper context, on which it is totally dependent. The human life form is, in some regards, like any animal life form or any life form. It is dependent on environmental conditions. And that's the way I want to think of humanity, independently of cultural, institutional, etc. Specifically, we always need to think of it in that kind of natural context. And I think that is definitely one of the reasons why there's much more interest now in philosophical anthropology, in my view.
And do the ideas that you have just highlighted, does that at all touch with what you wrote in Manifesto of Critical Naturalism? Yeah. So there's this Manifesto of Critical Naturalism that I co-wrote or co-authored with colleagues, Emmanuel Renaud from France, Italo Testa from Italy, and Arvi Särkelä and Federica Gregorato from Switzerland. Arvi is actually from Finland originally, and Federica is from Italy, but we co-authored this piece during COVID. We were meant to plan to meet in Paris, but then COVID happened, and then we ended up working online for a couple of years, producing this text that is now published, which basically argues that critical social philosophy, social thought, or critical theory, mainly but not only in the Frankfurt School tradition, needs to take our relationship with and dependence on nature much more seriously than it has done. There has been a lot of kind of skepticism and worry about naturalizing things. One of which, and many of those are perfectly understandable worries. I mean, there is this kind of ideological reductive naturalism that tries to justify, say, gender differences by appealing to putative natural differences, etc. That would be an ideological way of, or ideological naturalism. But we argue there that these legitimate worries should not lead to one thoroughly discrediting any reference to our dependence on nature or natural conditions. So basically we just want to argue that we really need to reintroduce our utter dependence on nature into critical theory or critical social thought, mainly in the Frankfurt School tradition, but also more broadly. And how has its reception been to fellow peers or?
Yeah, so it's very new. It only came out a few months ago in the journal Crisis. It's on online journal, and the next issue will contain some 15 or so responses to it by other people, and it remains to be seen what they say about. So it's still too early to say much about it, but I mean it has drawn quite a bit of attention, and it will appear, or parts of it, the 11 theses on critical naturalism that are part of the Manifesto, will appear in several languages soon, including Finnish. I made the translation, and I think Italo made an Italian translation, etc. So there will be reception in different countries as well, and we'll just see what comes out of that. I imagine part of the reception will be kind of academic in nature, that people are criticizing this or that theoretical aspect of it, or pointing out other authors who may have said the same already. So there's the kind of academic side to it, but hopefully it will have a little bit broader impact as well in the humanities and social science more broadly.
What do you think would be one of the few implications of this theory that could apply more broadly? How would it, I guess, how would its repercussions manifest?
Well, I guess there's the general question of how do changes at the level of philosophy or theory, how do they affect social changes? And often the influence is very indirect, and often will take a long time. But basically we are talking about paradigm shifts in thinking. And that's where philosophy is really of crucial importance. So kind of most of our basic ways, or many of our basic ways of thinking about human life were originally articulated by philosophers at some point, somewhere. And like a basic ideologies or isms or worldviews are all kind of refer to this, or kind of philosophical ways of thinking. So thinking in terms of paradigm shift, what we are doing in the Manifesto of Critical Naturalists is contributing into paradigm shift that we think is going on at the moment towards taking our dependence on nature much more seriously. How that will then affect the organization of social life, social process remains to be seen. But basically, I think it's fair to say that much of kind of the affluent Western or global northern countries have lived for the last many decades under the kind of illusion that the way we organize our economy or our life more generally has no natural kind of limits. I mean, it's kind of sounds stupid to say that, and everyone knows that it does have limits. But the system is organized in a way that presupposes that there are actually no limits. That the resources are unlimited, and we can keep on pushing as much pollution as we want, etc. And there's a kind of this growing appreciation that's not the case, but it has to go throughout all areas of society, all of the ways in which we think and organize social life, including economy, our ways of living, agriculture, all of that. And it's going to be a huge paradigm shift and huge revolution in the way in which we organize our societies, and it's just absolutely necessary if we want to avoid the worst imaginable crisis or catastrophes ahead.
It's interesting to hear sort of, I guess, the indirect implications of this topic of recognition, because in comparison to other, I suppose, more popular philosophical traditions or concepts or ideas today, such as like Stoicism, which is very, I think, individualistic, and it's very focused on you, whereas hearing you talk about the ideas surrounding recognition, it seems very socially related and has almost a different sort of effect with changing structures and changing dynamics and all of that. It's it's very cool to notice.
Yeah, so I think there is this kind of alternative social ontologies or ontologies of social or human life. They are more individualistic and more kind of holistic, if you want, ontologies. And much of kind of Western liberal political thought assumes a very individualistic or atomistic ontology of human being. And there's kind of, it's not surprising that Stoicism is kind of in fashion these days. It kind of fits into this extremely individualistic way of thinking of social life, which kind of liberal capitalism or capitalism encourages as well. And famously, Stoicism was born in a time in Roman or Mediterranean history where the individual didn't have much of a say in how the society was organized. So basically it says that whatever happens to you, the most important thing is what you think or how you organize what's inside of your mind or in your head, etc. So kind of extremely individualist in some regards. But then there is this tradition of thinking of human life as essentially social, which doesn't start from Hegel, but Hegel is definitely one of the main proponents of that way of thinking. I think that is not only kind of a healthier, more useful, but also the more truthful view. And we start thinking about it, then we are perfectly aware that we are dependent on other people in anything or everything that we do, basically. And we need to take that seriously in thinking about human life, in my view.
One of the first sort of thoughts that popped in my head as soon as we started this topic on recognition was, I wonder how would a Hegelian explain solitary confinement as a punishment, or sort of the idea that humans by themselves, say stuck on an island, would go crazy. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it is an extreme form of torture, exactly because of this dependence of human beings on other human beings, on communication with other human beings, on the other human being sort of a mirror and also a check to what I'm thinking, what I'm saying. And other people basically keep us from going insane. I mean, they may also often contribute very much to our going insane, but if there's no one else there to check what's going on with me, where my thoughts are going, etc., then that's really troubling, very, very precarious, difficult situation, and it can be extremely painful, horrible suffering, I imagine.
I sort of wonder, like, perhaps I don't have the idea totally right, but Satre is really famous for saying that, other people is hell. And I sort of wonder, within the contrasts of that, his idea of that perhaps, has been taken out of context, but in surface level seems like he's very precarious about the aspect of recognition regarding other people's judgment on him or recognition of him, because I think if I have the idea right, it can trap an individual to or put pressures on an individual to conform to a particular way.
Yeah.
Whereas, I sort of wonder what would be the Hegelian view of that same concept.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sartre was one of those intellectuals who sat in Alexander Kozhev's lecture that I mentioned earlier, and he takes up this theme of recognition from Hegel through Kozhev, but he gives it a very particular kind of reading, and his premises are kind of extremely individualistic. So on his presentation in the book Being and Nothingness, the look of the other is this persecuting look. So the basic idea of Sartre's humanism is that, as he puts it, existence precedes essence, meaning that we as human beings have this capacity to kind of transcend any given definition or description or essence that we may be kind of given. And the idea there is that the look of the other tries to pin me down to particular, tries to pigeonhole me into particular identities, etc. And therefore, it's kind of the look of the other is a hell. Now, there's insight in that, definitely, so that other people may do that. Often that's the case, that other people see me in light, or kind of in light of particular labels, or pigeonhole me, etc. And that's a problem. But obviously that's not always the case. That's not the only thing that the look of the other does. The look of the other is equally kind of constitutive of me having a human mind at all. This kind of constant kind of feedback loops and mutual relation with other. Without those, I would not have even developed a human mind who could be thinking of anything or any of the stuff that Sartre is thinking about. So it's kind of interesting application, but it's just really one tiny corner of this kind of whole gamut of what the recognition stuff and the kind of essential relationality of human being is about.
And if I'm not mistaken, Sartre was an indirect student of Hegel, wasn't he? He studied a lot of
so he sat in these lectures by Alexander Koshev, so he learned a bit of Hegel from there. But apparently he never really studied Hegel. He didn't know much about what Hegel actually wrote at that point. So he was an independent thinker, and he came up with his own system and just took influences from all kinds of places. And one of the influences was the general idea of the kind of recognition or perception or look of the other as having some sort of important influence on the individual.
On the other hand, was Heidegger a more direct student of Hegel than someone? Did he?
No. I mean Hegel died in 1830, was 31 anyway. So I mean these people were writing about 100 years later. So none of them were direct students of Hegel. And Hegel wasn't a huge influence in German philosophy, even when Heidegger was studying kind of Kant or neo-Kantianism, those kind of non-Hegelian forms of thinking were much more in vogue. Husserl's phenomenology was a big thing, and Heidegger was Husserl's student.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, Husserl didn't know apparently a lot about Hegel either. So and he wasn't very well informed about Hegel. Heidegger had written interesting things about Hegel, so he did study Hegel, but he writes about everything from his very particular perspective again. So it's kind of a great thinker in a way, which often means that they don't really do much justice to other thinkers. They just kind of think of their ideas from their own perspective.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see, I suppose, how these ideas then manifest and has its own implications, and following the logical, I guess, constraints that they put on their own perspective and theories, and how that sort of evolves.
There is the kind of the general theme of intersubjectivity here, which I think is relevant. That kind of Sartre's understanding of intersubjectivity in being and nothing is mainly negative. That's kind of the persecuting relation with the other that the intersubjectivity is about. Heidegger arguably has hard time in understanding intersubjectivity as somehow constitutive of our being. So he has this in his earlier work on being and time, the kind of ontology of Dasein, like basically structure of human existence, and I would argue that relations with others is kind of a secondary topic. They're secondary concern. They're not really thoroughly worked out, and it is also individualistic in a kind of existentialist way, somewhat similar to Satre, in that the influence of the others is mainly or primarily negative. The influence of others on Heidegger's view is that they are the they, or kind of the bad, inauthentic way of existing or living one's life is living like like they live, like everyone else lives, so to say. So it kind of paints this picture of others as this kind of mass that one should not be drawn to. One should find one's authentic individual way of being, and that's the way of living authentically. And then what is the role of relations to others in that authentic way of living? Heidegger doesn't have much to say about that. That was probably the reason why I eventually then became kind of left Heidegger behind, because it seemed to be that he doesn't have much to say about that thing, which I think for me is the most interesting thing actually.
It's interesting. There's probably a wild oversimplification of the matter, and one that Hegel himself would probably dislike, this non-duality. But it seems that these two branches then of existentialism in comparison to Hegelianism, or more loosely just the concept of recognition itself, are very diametrically opposed because of the way they view others and whether that has a positive or negative impact. I was sort of curious as well because I'm not aware of many students, not directly, but sort of philosophers who are influenced by Hegel, except for Slavoj Zizek, who is very, very popular amongst sort of me and my friends and sort of the younger generation. And I'm not, partly is because he's just so eccentric, but I also sort of wonder if you're familiar with his works at all. How do you see, what do you think is his interpretation of Hegel and how he has developed those ideas?
I have to say I don't know Zizek very well. I just mainly follow him on social media. I've read some things from him, but he's very much influenced by Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, which, by the way, was also one of the French intellectuals who sat on Alexander Kozhev's lectures on Hegel and got the idea of recognition from there, and it has a big impact on his psychoanalytical thinking. And the kind of one of the fundamental ideas there is this idea that recognition is always misrecognition, and it's kind of somewhat similar. There's some similarities to the Sartrean view, in which the view of the other is this kind of persecuting view, etc. Zizek is very much influenced by that way of thinking of Hegel, but I have to say I haven't really followed much of the details of his reading of Hegel. It's so fast and it's so all over the place that all the kind of difficult to follow. Very interesting thinker, very productive thinker too, and very entertaining thinker. Sometimes the kind of entertainment aspect kind of takes, in my view, a bit too big a role, but definitely someone interesting to follow.
I was kind of curious as well now that you mentioned it. What regarding sort of the relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy, because we briefly touched on that, I think, with Adorno, was it, in social critique, your class.
Yeah.
And I've always been kind of curious ever since what the relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy was, especially with someone like Lacan. I've tried so many times to research and somewhat understand his how he was influenced by psychoanalytics, but it's beyond me.
Yeah. No, Lacan is very difficult to read, but there are other thinkers in psychoanalysis and development of psychology who take very seriously this this interdependence, obviously, all psychoanalysts would take that very seriously. But the basic idea of recognition is something that very much resonates with psychoanalytic thinking. I think. I mean, it's kind of a commonplace in psychoanalytic thinking that the views of others will have an incredible impact on my view on myself. So there's an obvious connection there through this general idea of recognition or kind of constitutive intersubjectivity between psychoanalysis and then social philosophical thought in the kind of way in which I think about it. So I mean, one thing to say about philosophy or kind of academic disciplines is that sometimes people are very kind of protective of the boundaries between disciplines. In the area where I work, which is social philosophy, critical social philosophy, by its very nature, these disciplinary boundaries aren't very tight, and I think that's very healthy. I don't think we should be kind of religious about disciplinary boundaries. So whatever is useful from psychoanalysis for understanding social processes, we should just draw on that. Obviously, we should avoid a kind of reductionist understanding, a kind of monocausal understanding on which everything about social reality can be understood through this or that psychoanalysis theory, be it Lacanian or whatever. That would be the wrong interpretation. But basically, understanding the human situation and the space of human beings in the world requires drawing in any sort of useful body of information, whichever discipline it is from.
Especially, I think, regarding sort of living the good life, especially, I find the correlations or the relationship between psychology and philosophy to be, very natural.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's not just within philosophy itself, but in psychology it can be very restrictive too, in that sense. Learning about psychology at UNSW is very science-driven,
right?
And scientific, and responds to a lot of different things. But the reputation of trying to assert itself as like a very hard science is very palpable. I think that's been one of the things that was a shock to me when I started studying psychology, was just how rigid it was. And in some ways, as someone with clinical aspirations, or at least at the time, it was very disappointing in some ways, because it was very very rigid, and it's got nothing to do with social interactions or sort of understanding a human being, at least in terms of life, rather than in terms of biology and neurology and all that sort of stuff.
So often hear from psychology students in my class when we talk about Freud or psychoanalysis, kind of that's not real science, or that's not real psychology, and that's what one often learns in studying psychology in universities, and part of that is the kind of felt need to defend the kind of sciencey status of that discipline. But more generally, in kind of abstracting from that, there is kind of more science, kind of natural scientific perspective to psychology, and then a more humanistic perspective to psychology. And the latter one is more interested in interpretation of what's going on and what's crucial for human mind and personality development, etc. And it is the latter kind of perspective which very easily then works together with philosophical perspectives.
I wonder if, say, psychology has almost disregarded Freud and his ideas, or most of it anyways, of his ideas of psychoanalysis. I wonder then, has it been the same response by the philosophical community, and whether, because they operate on different realms and have different goals, that perhaps philosophy is still able to entertain some thoughts from psychoanalysis that, although might be scientifically irrelevant or disinteresting, that in philosophy is actually a fruitful area to.
Yeah, though one has to say that this there's kind of similar divide within philosophy, broadly speaking, too. That there are more kind of science-like or sciencey approaches in philosophy, and then more humanities focused, or kind of more humanities-like approaches in philosophy. Much of contemporary philosophy of mind, say, is naturalistic in a reductive sense. Basically, tries to understand the human mind in terms of natural processes, causal processes, mechanical processes, etc. Tries to reduce those processes to what the natural sciences say the world is like. That is a very alive approach in contemporary philosophy. And then there is this more humanist hermeneutic way of thinking about philosophy. Maybe that is an important divide within the philosophy discipline. I've been very critical of the so-called analytical continental divide in philosophy. I think that's mostly a waste of people's time and energy than kind of fighting those sort of turf wars. But it has to be said that there are kind of radical differences in terms of orientation within the philosophical community, the philosophical discipline. Some are more kind of understand themselves closer to science or wanting to understand the world in terms of what the science is about the world, and others are more drawn to kind of hermeneutic, humanistic understanding. And obviously, kind of academic, scientific psychology works better with the first one, the kind of more naturalistic, in a reductive sense, approach in philosophy. Psychoanalysis works better with the more humanities focused, the humanities approach to philosophy.
What I feel like I've looked this up before. What does hermeneutic in terms of philosophy means?
Well, by hermeneutic simply mean interpretation, and it has to do with meanings. So that when I talk about mental processes, the hermeneutic perspective is looking into meanings, process of meaning, and association, etc. Whereas the kind of more hard science approach would be looking at the kind of at brain processes, at causal processes, etc., rather than meaning. Now there are of course attempts to reduce meaning to natural processes as well, but hermeneutics is not interested in that question whether meaningful process can be reduced somehow to causal process, etc. It's just interested in those meanings, and that's the core of what psychoanalysis works with. It works with meanings and works with kind of associations and etc. and things hidden underneath explicit consciousness, etc. Experiences and what they have meant for an individual, what they associate with, what they bring to mind, etc. So understanding psychoanalysis from that perspective is really understanding it as a hermeneutic enterprise rather than a scientific enterprise.
I think it's been an hour and a half. I was wondering whether you want to take a break or keep going.
Sure, yeah. Let's take a little break, yeah. Go on, get some water. I'm a little bit worried about to say because the university might have some views, but we can have a general chat.
Yeah, and obviously if you maybe reflect on it and you're not comfortable with
right. Yeah,
just edit that out.
Because there's something I don't know what to say to my students now, and that I want to contradict myself. Anyway. Yeah,
but I wonder sort of how AI would play in philosophy in general, not just in university studies. Because at the moment I'm not sure how capable it is of producing original thought.
It's not. I mean, it's really the nature of the thing. I mean, there's this kind of catastrophe hype, that mindset that AI will take over the world. but none of these softwares are doing anything like that.
Yeah.
And they are just they're just predicting which word most likely comes after which word, etc. That's all they do. Now they don't understand anything. They don't produce anything new in an interesting way. Of course, it's an interesting question. What is it to produce new thing in any case by human mind either?
Yeah,
Also.
I think. Yeah, it seems to me at least it's only generally useful in helping you maybe comprehend things and breaking things down into more digestible sort of.
Perhaps I have to say I don't have. How we started, by the way.
Yeah.
I have to say I don't have enough experience of what it can actually do with a difficult philosophical text, because I mean there is this thing when one reads philosophical text, difficult philosophical text, one needs to get to the core ideas. And there is no formula for that. There's no kind of obvious way in how to find those core ideas. There's nothing you can give, kind of program to an algorithm that would help it to find them. It can only have this kind of formal cues, something like that. But it's difficult for me to see how an AI program like the ones that we now have could make actually a difference between what's important and what's not important. And this goes back now to the topic that we discussed earlier about meaning. We touched upon that earlier. I mean, these programs don't have a clue about meaning, and a clue about what's important. What's important, what's relevant, that is something that only a mind that has concerns can make distinctions between. We humans are concerned of various things, like Heidegger says. Sorge is a kind of this concern is a kind of constitutive feature of our existence and mind, and this we're constitutively worried or concerned of how our lives will go, etc. And that worry generally kind of sets up relevant structure. Something is relevant for those worries, other things are not relevant. Something is more important, other things are not important. Some things are good, other things are not good. And a being or an algorithm that is not a worrying being cannot make any of those distinctions. And therefore, I am skeptical of their capacity to distinguish between what in a text is important and what is not. Unless the text is written in a simple format where there's a kind of system in which those are generally distinguished within the text. And nothing like that exists in philosophy. I don't think should exist in philosophy. It should be a creative enterprise.
Yeah, I think, I was thinking as you were saying that as well, like, there are different levels of reading in books and difficulty of those books, but generally the structure seems to be that, at least in the form of essays and stuff like that, you can get the main points from maybe, if it's well written, the introduction and the conclusion will contain a brief summary of the main points that will be discussed. But as you said, if we were to just apply this formula to an AI, it would work for all the instances that the text it's reading does have that structure. However, once it encounters a text that doesn't have that structure, it sort of just falls apart. It will just apply that formula sort of without concern of whether it is actually important. And I think it seems to me what you're saying is we have a value system to decide what's relevant.
That's right. But values are kind of normatively, broadly speaking, is really constitutive of human mind and the human way of being in the world, and it does not exist for AI. It's not a concerned being. It doesn't have values. It doesn't have priorities, etc. Except for those that can be somehow programmed into it. And that's not easy. I
wonder, semantically speaking, or maybe epistemologically speaking, how would one program values into an AI? The human equivalent of values.
Well, we can do kind of mimicking there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess that's important now, kind of technological or technically important in robotics. There's all kinds of attempts to apply robotics, say in elderly care, etc., or kind of these human relations, human service roles. And I guess you have to be able to program behavior that mimics values and cares.
Yeah.
Like kind of expressions that sound like the expressions of a being that actually, say, cares about you or likes you. But of course, the thing itself cannot care or like. It just does not have a mind capable of that. It's not a being that has any values or priorities. We can make it mimic all kinds of things, but not have the real thing.
What interests me is then, I think human beings have always been able to look past certain maybe imperfections and all of that. And so I wonder whether we could get to a level where AI can mimic value systems and all these different things, but we as humans impose then the reality or the sentience of it all, because it fools us enough to the point that we it replicates or mimics values well enough that we think they actually do, even though they don't.
Yeah. So these questions are like questions when say in autonomous steering cars, etc., and also in military robotics, etc. One needs to have some sort of algorithm for distinguishing between different cases, when to shoot, when not to shoot, and those algorithms, those programs have to be based or will be based on some sort of value decisions by those who program them into them, or the autonomous driving car, whether it will prior, if it sees a human being and sees something else there, which one it will hit, etc. Those kind of things will have to be written into it. But I think that concerns technology more broadly. All technology does reflect our value systems in one way or another. So that's of course perfectly possible and is happening at the moment. Now, with regard to the possibility of an artificial being that actually can care, that's an interesting challenge. I think it would have to be kind of built from the bottom up. It would have to be a living being, because only for living beings something is good and bad. And so in some relevant sense, it would have to be a living being that is concerned, first of all, of its own survival. That's the kind of driving thing for all living beings. The most important thing is whether to live or flourish or to die or wither away. That's already the kind of organizing principle for plant life, and then for animal life. Now, of course, that's also problematic because that's also the root of all evil. Because my survival might mean your death, or the other way around. So starting it from there basically is kind of starting the world again, and we know that that's a nasty process. All kinds of nasty things have happened and will continue happening. So yeah.
Yeah, I wonder whether, I don't wonder actually. I'm sure that at some point someone will try to inject that sort of survival value as it's very as the most core component of an AI's mind or whatever. And I think from that point onwards, the question of whether it would be a living being and whether it's sentient would become very much more real.
Yeah. So it would be a living being in that sense that it is concerned of its own existence. And there's of course these figures in science fiction, say the computer HAL in Space Odyssey 2001, whatever that was, who wants to kill the human being because the human being wants to kill it, basically, or shut it down, etc.
Yeah.
So it's kind of what dystopian nightmares are made. That's how humanity will end. I don't know if there's any kind of, if it's a real option or whatever, but something to be concerned about. But anyway, I don't think this generative AI thing is doing at the moment anything like that.
Yeah, I think we're safe.
We are talking about two quite different things. Yeah.
Yeah. You've kind of mentioned one aspect, one critical aspect of studying philosophy today and its implications for young students and as a society for it to be able to self-reflect and I guess understand its own position in the world. Now I was sort of wondering whether there are other sort of benefits to studying philosophy for young students that you think should be more outspoken about or should be more explicit, because I think a lot of people can see it as maybe too ephemeral or phantasmological.
Yeah. So, what's the good thing about reflection? I mean, basically, what I mean by reflection is just thinking about something, trying to grasp what something is made of, how it should be made of, what's going to happen, or how everything relates to everything else. And I think for anyone living in contemporary societies, which are extremely kind of fast, dynamic, constantly changing, and kind of in some regards chaotic and kind of scary in that way, it's just really important for one's well-being to be able to understand what's going on, understand the social process, and basically anything seems, well, most things at least seem less scary or less troubling when one understands them. They're not totally overwhelming, just kind of scary, unknown forces over me. And I think it is really the nature of contemporary societies, which are so dynamic, to use that nice word, that they require kind of thinking skills from individuals for those individuals to be able to live flourishing lives there, not to be overwhelmed or not to be surprised and shocked and devastated when something happens. Something which might have been predictable if one would have a broader understanding of social processes, but which will come as a surprise for someone who does not have those capacities. So it is to be able to reflect on one's life is incredibly important. Also, I'd say in social relations, I mean, philosophy is not necessarily sufficient for one's capacity to understand what's going on in a particular social relations. I mean, it depends on what sort of philosophy one talks about. The philosophers often talk at a very high level of abstraction. But generally speaking, flourishing social relations require, among other things, that those who participate them are capable of reflecting what they are doing, what the other is doing. Why did I say that? Why did I behave that? And capable of taking a step back, taking a breath, taking a step back and reorienting oneself, apologizing, etc. That's also about kind of reflective thinking skills. Psychology has a lot to say about human relations, but I think that generally speaking, being able to reflect on one's behavior of others is also good in personal life. And we may end up doing stupid things, but if we can take a step back and reflect, we may be able to learn from them and do better next time. Probably would be better human beings for other human beings when we have those capacities.
I was wondering as well, as you mentioned, like society has almost been progressing exponentially, and it feels like the human experience is so fast nowadays, especially maybe if you're living in a city or something like that, that I wonder whether this puts even more emphasis on the importance of something like philosophy and just reflection in general. Because I kind of wonder, I feel like I didn't really think until maybe quite recently, and it feels like a lot of my life have just been almost existing and reacting to different environmental stimuli, and I just sort of been floating through life. But I kind of wonder how many people kind of are either maybe still like that, or how often can we actually carve a space and some time for us to reflect, especially in an environment as chaotic as ours. And I kind of wonder, whether your experiences living in a smaller country like Finland and stuff compared to here, whether the experience of time and sort of the calmness you feel psychologically has been any different.
Yeah, certainly to be able to reflect on things and take a step back, it requires also time. It requires the peace for doing that. And one of the things that is worrying these days that we don't seem to, we are never bored. And we never have that kind of lull of moment. Nothing's happening. I could just think of something. And social media, obviously, and mobile phones, all the gadgets that beeping have a lot to do with that. They're really addictive in a way which kind of leaves no empty time, or very little empty time. So that is serious worry. And I think it is actually a challenge these days for students, including perhaps especially philosophy students, to develop habits of just taking a lot of time, just sitting down, doing nothing else, not paying attention to anything else, not being on this or that app, just focusing on one thing, reading a difficult text, for instance, and thinking about complex things, writing a complex text. It's challenging these days in a way which probably was not challenging early, to the extent at least. Where I come from in Finland, and kind of small place there, not much was happening there. In countryside, a small place is kind of less immediately kind of alarming, or things that kind of demand your attention. Less of those things are happening within a day or hour than in a big city, for instance. And that kind of big cities, and then also as time goes by, all of these social processes accelerate, and there are more apps calling for attention, etc. It kind of seems to be becoming more and more difficult. But this kind of time, kind of economy of time, is really important, I think.
Do you feel like in some ways you've been buttressed against such a rapid acceleration of this experience of time, because you've had those experiences in Finland and growing up in a quieter, more of environment, that you've been able to develop those habits that philosophy students nowadays might find difficult, such as spending time alone and all that?
Yeah. I probably am privileged in that sense. Because actually I had a very lived experience of that. After I wrote my master's thesis, then went to Helsinki and was a school teacher there for a year. That's already a bigger city, and there was lots going on there, lots of interesting things to do, and kind of drawing my attention to them. And then I got my first academic job back in Jyväskylä, that smaller town where I did my studies. And my immediate experience of that was that it was really good that there wasn't that much happening there. It was a smaller town, a much quieter town, and it suited me at that point really well, because then really you had a lot of time, kind of calm and peace to read and think, etc. So definitely that was very productive for me at that point, and I can totally see it that living today in a kind of fast moving city like Sydney, that's not at all that easy. It's much harder, and definitely much harder for myself also. And when I moved then here, of course, already living in a foreign country is a kind of disorienting in a way that everything is new, or so many things are new, or you don't know what anything means. You don't know the history of the places. You see things happening, you don't quite understand that. They're kind of disorienting, which is not good for peace of mind. So I had to say that I kind of have had to develop that kind of capacity to calm down again here. And it's something I think for which one has to struggle always. One has to keep that in mind, that I have to kind of keep on fighting to have that calm around me. And it is very much, as you suggest, it's a matter of habitualization. So good study habits are really important. And the time of COVID has been especially difficult in that regard. I mean, on the one hand, good in the sense that social processes kind of slowed down. Less things were happening. We had more time in that sense. But on the other hand, that we were at home where all these apps were beeping and all of things were kind of calling our attention, and we didn't have the structure of, say, going to campus and sitting at the desk, then it was very difficult to keep up or develop good study habits. Now the situation has changed again. I think really important for students to kind of foster, cultivate and develop those habits of kind of focusing on one thing. And then an important thing is how to enjoy doing that.
Yeah, I think that's very understated oftentimes.
Yeah.
The enjoyment aspect.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So how to enjoy sitting in a chair. I like to sit in an armchair. It could be at the desk, hours on and days on and weeks on. How could that be enjoyable? For me, I mean, some people kind of for some people that comes easy. I mean, they are kind of maybe kind of bookish from very early on, that they just really love being around books and reading books, and I do too. But I do think that one of the things one needs to do, if that kind of doesn't come naturally, is to make the environment somehow enjoyable. For me, it is important that when I sit in my armchair and read, that I see something enjoyable, for instance, that my room is organized in such a way that what I see when I look up from the computer or book looks nice. There's a nice picture on the wall, and it's not totally chaotic in my room, which often, unfortunately, it is, but it shouldn't be too chaotic. And ideally, there should be something nice that I see out of the window. That's luxury. One can have it. One can always have it. I mean, something green or something like that. And then I go and make a tea or coffee or have maybe a cookie or something like that. Kind of pamper myself a little bit. That helps me to calm down. Feel good about just sitting down and doing nothing else than reading or writing. And I think something like that is really important for students to develop as well. Whatever it takes for you to enjoy that thing of sitting down and just focusing on one thing, then do that.
Yeah, I think that's very, as I said, understated. Sort of allowing yourself to indulge in how to make it enjoyable for yourself.
That's right. Yeah.
Because if it's not enjoyable, then you come up against another obstacle that is already to something very hard, just sitting down.
That's right.
Yeah. So you're putting more obstacles in the way.
Yeah, that's actually right. Yeah. So,
final question. I like to ask this because it's very tongue-in-cheek and over cliche. But considering that I've been interviewing philosophers, I'd like to ask, what is the meaning of life, to end the podcast?
The goal of life is to do something good.
Something good in terms of how you see it, other people?
Something good for others.
Something good for others.
Yeah. As some people say, to leave the world a little better than it was when you enter it. From some little aspect. To contribute to something good. I think that's what makes life meaningful. It could be within your family. I mean, people who have children, it could be contributing to the life of your children. It could be in your work, or it could be in writing, say. That's how I see philosophical work. That's what gives it meaning, that is contributing to something good, trying to improve something, people's understanding of something, and thereby hopefully the world. That's what one can be satisfied about at the end of life.
Mm.
And that's what one will be remembered for, positively be recognized for.
You think for students currently, what would doing something good look like?
It must be very personal. I mean, it really depends on who one is, what one's situation in life is, what's the kind of circumstances in what one live, in which one lives, what one profession is, what one capacities are, etc. And people have different talents, capacities, etc. So there's only something that I can do. I can do what I can do in writing, in teaching, and then of course I can do something within my family, perhaps with for my friends, etc. Someone in politics, say, can have a lot of a major influence, kind of more or less immediate influence to the lives of many people, and then. What's the point of that? Well, obviously to do something good. That's what people are elected for when they're elected for political office.
Would you say it's also important not to compare what you do as good to others? And that it's very personal, that process of figuring out how you want to be good to others.
Yeah, so I mean, what I mean, thinking of from this kind of social perspective, a kind of collective or holistic perspective, what kind of life is a collective or collaborative enterprise. We live our lives with others, and we contribute to each other's life in multiple or myriads of ways. So what is a good contribution that I can do is not something that's only up to me to decide. It's very much for the others to judge, or for the collective to judge what actually would be a valuable contribution that I could make to the social cooperation or the kind of common good, so to say. But then there's the other thing, kind of what good can I do for myself in such a way that I enjoy living my life. I mean, I could of course sacrifice myself for the common good, but that's probably not going to be a very happy or satisfying life. It could be satisfying in some regards. Maybe it suits some characters better than others. But there are all kinds of things one need to do for oneself to live a satisfying, successful, healthy life, etc. Take care of your health. Take care of your physical health. Take care of your mental health. Take care of your economic circumstances to the extent that you can, not doing very stupid decisions if one can avoid that, etc. Those are kind of things that one can do for oneself and should do oneself, but they also will affect others around one. So all of that also then comes down to one's on others. So say if I as a member of a family don't take care of myself, it's going to have negative impacts on my family members. They're going to be miserable or unhappy if I'm miserable and unhappy. So all of that, even the kind of most kind of personal things, are also related to other people always. So basically, to make people around oneself happy, part of that is trying to make oneself happy, so that one is someone who is nice to be around.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you very much for coming on. Yeah, any final words?
No, that's it. Thanks a lot, Johnson.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.